Hello and welcome back to A Splash of Paint, where it's time for us to read your versatile experimental SAA artist Alison Board as she puts the final finishing touches to today's watercolour project.
Thanks, Matthew. Earlier on in the programme, you saw me get my painting to this stage, which was to play about with some wet into wet techniques, wetting the paper, playing chicken with it, and adding the colour. Now we get to do the fun bit, which is to paint in the main subject matter, which are my lovely birch trees here. And we're going to use a very similar technique to do that, but rather than using plain water to do the wet into wet, we're going to use a paint and then drop our colour into that. So back to the palette. I've left all my colours out on the palette so that they're there ready to use for next time. Now, I need to make these trees much bolder. They are my subject matter and they need to come forward so they can be brighter, warmer and darker colours. So I'm going to mix up the alizarin crimson again, nice and strong. And to that, I'm going to add a little bit of the black, just to take the edge off of that colour ever so slightly. And what you end up with is a rather lovely maroony kind of colour, perfect for what it is that I'm going to do next. Now I'm going to thin that out with water, just to take it back a little bit. And that's what I'm going to use for my wet into wet on the main areas of the trunks. Dropped into that, I want to use a much darker colour. So I'm going to use this little puddle of brown that I've got over here. Mix it up again, coating the bristles, making sure you've got no lumps and bumps in the paint, and adding some black to that. So I've got two dark colours, one that's a little bit weaker and one that's a little bit stronger. So washing off my brush, making sure that it's relatively clean and hasn't got any little bits of paint on it. You don't want to stroke those back into your trees just yet. We are going to use some texture techniques later, but not right now. So picking up my first colour, which was the alizarin crimson and the black, and I'm going to work my way down my tree trunk. This time I want to be a little bit neater because I do want my tree to have some hard edges. There we go, but it doesn't matter if it hits and misses, it all adds to the texture. And I can use the water taken off on my brush just to blend it out if the edges are getting a little bit hard, or alternatively using the kitchen roll back in. So there we go, pulling the colour all the way down. So I've let my paint just drift off into the bottom so that it gives that unfinished look to my picture, which I like, soft edges all the time. Working into the next tree, keeping an eye on that, making sure that it stays damp so that I can drop my colour in. If you make any mistakes, that's fine. You can just use your kitchen roll to mop them up, not a problem. Working the way all the way down, using the texture of the paper. And there we go. Just at the top, it's a little bit of a hard edge. Blend it out with some water, take it out with the kitchen roll. Same at the bottom, blending it out, taking it out with the kitchen roll. That's great, that's just how I want it. And then the last one, that's almost ready to go, that first one now. Coming all the way down, keeping my nice neat edges of my trees so that they almost blend into the background, but not quite. Washing out the brush, using the water, blending it out, taking off the excess. There we go. Now, this one is already ready to go. So I can start, and there we go. It's just blending out ever so slightly. I nearly missed the boat, but it's just about right. There we go, back in. This one's a bit better. I've timed this one a little better. Bringing down my shadows, just adding to the emphasis of the tree shape. There we go, again, using kitchen roll. Kitchen roll's marvellous stuff. You can create great textures with it. Then back into here, into the last one, putting in some shadows and letting it do the thing that watercolour does best, which is creeping away on its own while you don't even notice it. There we go, almost done. A few little touches, and I can now let that dry, ready to work on it with my textures. While that's drying, I'd like to show you a quick brush technique. So I'm going to switch to this beautiful brush, a flat brush, which I'm going to use to create those silver birch lines that you get dragged across the trunk. Now this technique is best used with nice thick paint and a nice dry brush, so don't be tempted to drop your brush straight into the water, otherwise you'll miss the opportunity to get the rough edges. I'm going to switch back to my big Kolinsky round to mix up some colours ready. So for this we're going to use lots of black, And looking back at my painting, I'm thinking, do I want to use the brown or do I want to use the red? And I think I'm going to use the brown in with it to make some really lovely, deep, dark textural shadows on there. You can always test the colour. So you can come back over here and think to yourself, does that colour look about right? And don't forget, watercolour dries back 2 shades. So however dark it looks when you put it on the paper, it's going to dry a little bit paler than that. That, for me, I think is going to be just about right. So switching back to my flat brush, we're going to dip that straight into the paint, no water at all. And we're going to have a little bit of kitchen roll ready. So straight into the paint, coating the ends of the bristles, and then you're going to use the kitchen roll to make the ends of the bristles of the brush stick out, really scissor-edged. Then when you go back into your tree in a minute, you can drag that across the page, and it will hopefully recreate those lovely textural marks that you get on silver birch trees. You can scrub away at your surface and add to that, and that will create the marks that you're looking for. Now, if it's not quite dark enough, that's absolutely fine. You can add back into it, or you can be really brave and mix your colour up darker, whichever you prefer. I'm going to try to be really brave and mix up my colour. So there we go, even darker. You can also do it another way. Rather than putting your brush back into the paint to coat it, you can use your round brush to coat the end of the bristles if you find that easier. But always have a little bit of watercolour paper to hand. Always have your kitchen roll to hand, and don't be afraid to get your fingers involved and fan out the bristles of your brush. That way, when you go back in, there we go, that's better, you can create some really beautiful marks. So I'm going to go back to my trees now. I'm going to test them with the back of my hand to make sure that they are dry enough, and they feel pretty dry to me. It's always a good test, the back of your hand. Try not to poke your finger back in it, because if you poke your finger back in it, you'll make a mark. The back of your hand, at least if it's still wet, you'll end up with a more natural mark on your paper. Now that brush is pretty good to go. I'm just going to add a little bit more colour because I like my textures really, really dark. And I'm going to use my fingers to spread it out, and I'm going to work my way down the side of this tree, adding shadows, adding textures, working on it as I go. Using the corner of my brush as well to add little areas of interest. Try not to, when you're painting a natural form, get into the habit of making very repetitive brush strokes because it won't look natural. You need to get into the habit of messing about with it, pulling it apart, adding a few bits here and there. Try not to be too ordered about it. That way your trees are going to end up looking much more natural. There you go, just a few more on that one. That's almost done. There's a few things I still want to do to that, but I'm going to crack on and do the other 2 trunks. There we go. A few little textures up here. That's good. It runs out of paint quite quickly, your brush, doing it this way, but that's all right. Less is more. Getting into the corners. There we go, adding a few textures. I'll try the other way this time. Putting it straight into the paint, taking it off on my kitchen roll, pulling it across, dragging it down, pulling it across, working it as you go. That's a bit ordered in there. I'm going to alter that a little bit. Sometimes a good idea to adopt the shaky hand principle to work your way down the tree. That works very well. There we go. I might add some more later, but for the time being, I've got a few more other things to add. I'm going to switch to my rigger brush now. Nice long hairs, originally designed for painting rigging on ships, but they're great for doing branches and grasses and things. And again, straight into the paint. Don't need to think about it too hard. And I like to use my rigger brush a little bit further down the handle so I have less control over it. And then I'll put it into my tree and use the tip of it, wiggling it down the tree trunk. Then I can add those little bits of definition that just make the tree pop out and just make it come to life a little bit more. Riggers are also brilliant for using on their side, so I can add to that texture. Coming all the way down. Again, it runs out of paint very quickly, so don't worry, have plenty of paint mixed up on your palette. Using it up above, letting it do its little wiggle and flick thing. Using it on its side, all those things that make your tree look like the natural form that it is. Coming from below, all the way up, wiggling it, adding those knots and all the things that make trees interesting, adding the bits of texture. So back in, this is the fun bit. This is like sculpting with paint. Doing my little wiggles and flicks, using the side of my rigger, coming all the way down, using the side of my rigger. There we go. I'm going to actually add a little bit of water to that because that's come out quite strong. But this is the great thing about these techniques, is that you can alter them as you go. There we go. That works. I'm going to do that to the first one as well because that's worked rather well for me. Add some colour back in, working my way up. So nice, simple techniques for you to use. And because you're working in natural forms, you don't have to worry about being so precise. It doesn't look like my original reference material, but that's fine. All I've done is use that reference material as a guide. Having a look at them, thinking, do they look like trees? Adding a bit more colour, getting down to the bottom and not worrying about it too much. This is a great excuse for working out what your materials can do for you. Adding bits of texture, and then these are techniques that you can employ in your larger paintings, or if you wanted to do an entire big painting of birch trees. So just one last little finishing touch, and I'm pretty happy with that. I hope you've enjoyed the techniques that you've seen today, and I look forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks, Alison. Great project for getting to grips with watercolour and experimenting with wet-into-wet techniques. Right, folks, it's time for our final break, but join us in part 4 when popular pencil wizard Malcolm Cudmore conjures up some more simple advice for seeing the world in a different light. And versatile artist Paul Beattie demonstrates an easy-to-follow technique for adding a touch of texture to your paintings. See you soon.